So the title of my presentation today is I'm going to stop sharing this. Is remote sensing and advanced technologies, why now? So what I'd like to do is provide you with a little bit of context as to why the Forest Pest Working Group is hosting this seminar series. For those of you that aren't familiar, because I know we're reaching a pretty broad audience here, the Forest Pest Working Group is a working group of the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers, and they've been around for over a decade. The Forest Pest Working Group facilitates ongoing discussion and collaboration between federal, provincial, and territorial forest pest management agencies in Canada, with members from all provinces and territories except Nunavut and PEI, as well as membership from the Canadian Forest Service and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Its work focuses on the implementation of a national forest pest strategy, providing for an integrated framework for forest pest prevention, detection, and response. So back in 2005, the Forest Pest Working Group undertook a survey of provincial and territorial forest pest managers' involvement, their concerns or perceptions with regards to forest health and climate change. The survey found that consistent monitoring and disturbance-related research were the most important aspects of addressing climate-related forest health issues. Yet, most reported lack of consistent funding and limited or inconsistent monitoring. These results triggered the need to characterize the risks to current forest health monitoring policies and practices and their ability to inform effective pest management under a future climate change scenario. This led to the vulnerability assessment, which was completed in 2019. So the vulnerability assessment was based on a guidebook developed by the Climate Change Task Force of Canadian Council of Forest Ministers. They prepared a very extensive guidebook a number of years ago, which we used for this vulnerability assessment. And basically what you do is you assess a system to see how vulnerable it is, and a system can be a biophysical system, or in this case, a human system, the human system being the forest health monitoring system. So what we did, the vulnerability is described as the degree to which forest health monitoring is susceptible to or unable to cope with effects of climate change in terms of achieving forest health monitoring objectives. So for the objectives for the purposes of this assessment were to detect and record biotic and abiotic disturbances to Canada's forests. And you'll notice it says forests, it doesn't say managed forests. That was intentional. We wanted to capture all forests, whether they're productive or unproductive or managed or unmanaged forests. We want to be able to use these results to help improve our understanding of hazard and risk, and then use these results to help inform our forest health management decisions. So the vulnerability assessment takes a look, we look at stage 2 over on the left-hand side. We take a look at what our current climate and forest condition looks like, and then we take a look at what the future climate will do to the disturbance regimes that we've described in that second phase. So we brought Dr. David Price in from Northern Forestry Research. And he suggested that we use RCP 8.5, which is business as usual, which we projected to 2014. And so we attempted to describe changes in forest disturbance regimes based upon this climate change scenario. And from this, we looked at what our current monitoring capacity was, where we were conducting monitoring, and whether or not we had the adaptive capacity to address these changes. So talking about the monitoring status that we looked at for this report, for the vulnerability assessment, the map obviously is a map of Canada, RCP 8.5 to 2040, and we can see that as expected, we have a lot of warming happening in the north. The yellow line is the extent of aerial surveys, one of the primary tools we have for monitoring forest pests. The extent of aerial surveys in 2018. And if we look at that in terms of what percentage of forests did it capture, it's about 57% of all forests are being monitored, representing 79% of all managed forests. So that's not a bad number, and up considerably from our previous number in 2011. Annual survey coverage is dependent upon forest health program funding and therefore can vary depending upon other programs' demands. So recall I mentioned that in that 2015 scoping document, there was concerns about inconsistent funding available for monitoring, and this is really key to trying to detect some of these changes related to climate change. One of the other things we found with trying to get an inventory on our monitoring was that not all jurisdictions monitor abiotic disturbances proactively. Some are still doing it reactively, where they'll go out and map a windstorm event or ice damage, etc., although that's changing very quickly. The ground surveys, and there's over 14,000 plots across Canada, where I'm not showing you the map here, but the ground surveys that are conducted for forest pests are generally for defoliators, and they're generally focused on life stages of the major defoliators for the purposes of operational pest management programs. We also found in this assessment that pathogen monitoring is very low. We do, through aerial surveys, we do map foliar diseases and some declines, but we don't map things such as root diseases. So this is that stage 2 where we looked at what's happening in Canada right now, and this is a pretty crude map trying to depict what we know is happening with regards to forest health and disturbance regimes as a result of climate change. So you'll see that over in Western Canada, we have a lot of examples, and that's basically because, as you know, over the last decade, we've had numerous drought events, and some which have been pretty significant and consecutive as well. But we are starting to see examples in Eastern Canada as well, and I suspect this map will change over the course of a few years. But things like declines on the West Coast, we've got yellow cedar decline in British Columbia, we've got birch decline in southeastern British Columbia and Quebec as well. We've got aspen decline persistent throughout the prairie provinces and Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and parts of British Columbia. What else? We've got a northern shift of defoliator range. We've got false hemlock looper in Alberta, extending further north than ever before. Eastern spruce budworm in Quebec, eastern hemlock looper potentially in Quebec as well, and in Newfoundland. We're seeing changes in pest complexes as a result of these abiotic triggers. So we're seeing, for instance, there's an example in Saskatchewan where we're seeing monocamus, which is a wood borer, defoliating jack pine, which was drought stressed, so they're pretty unusual events. We've also got larch beetle responding to weakened larch as a result of drought stress. And of course, we've got permafrost melting in the north, in the Northwest Territories, as well as a lot of high water level events, which is causing extensive flooding in many parts of Northwest Territories. So, you know, this is just what we know is happening now, and we anticipate that this is going to change. And do we have the capacity to map all of these concerns and to inform some of our decisions as we move forward? So the outcome of the vulnerability assessment validated the concerns from 2015 climate change scoping document, which basically indicated that the forest health monitoring system was indeed vulnerable to climate-induced changes. This is in large part due to the uncertainty with climate change. We all know that nobody really knows what's going to happen. And the institutional resistance to change in light of uncertainty. There are not many managers who are willing to go out on a limb and make and provide funding to programs with such high degrees of uncertainty. There's also limited capacity to conduct forest health monitoring activities in some jurisdictions. When we did an inventory of monitoring way back in 2011, at the time, we knew that we had geographic gaps in the north that we weren't monitoring, but nobody was really talking about sort of capacity gaps as it related to people who were able to conduct aerial surveys. And we're hearing that more and more all the time. So we have now concerns from several jurisdictions about existing capacity and future capacity with regards to aerial surveyors. And also one of the other things was a lack of flexibility of forest management policies. And what this is referring to is we traditionally have done aerial surveys and most of our ground surveys in areas that are unmanaged forests. And so there's been a reluctance and not really much of a mandate to go beyond those managed forests and into the unmanaged forest. However, those unmanaged forests could serve as an indicator of things that could happen in the managed forest. And not to mention that if the climate continues to shift as expected, maybe those unmanaged forests will become the managed forests of the future. So we were deemed vulnerable, and because we were deemed vulnerable, we identified adaptation options. We identified 14 adaptation options to deal with this vulnerability, of which we prioritized 4 of them. The top 2 sort of can be summed up into this statement, which is supplementing or complementing existing forest health monitoring systems with new technologies and broadening our monitoring scope beyond managed forests and major pests. So concurrently, while we were developing this, the vulnerability assessment, we were also in the process of building a business case template for use by forest pest managers. So once this business case template was completed, we decided to use it sort of as a case study to promote an enhanced forest health monitoring program. This was completed last year. It's a very exhaustive, lengthy document, looks at all sorts of things, including, the risk of maintaining the status quo and sort of the benefits of having an enhanced forest health monitoring program. One of the recommendations within that document was the further evaluation of remote sensing products and tool sets are required to identify a suitable product for an enhanced forest health monitoring program. So that basically lands us to today. That's why this seminar series is being conducted. We're basically we, the Forest Pest Working Group, seeking to educate ourselves on what tools are out there in terms of advanced technologies and remote sensing. How feasible are they? How available are they? What kind of capacity do we need to implement them? And we brought together this group of speakers basically to educate us because it's time to have this conversation. So before I sign off, I would like to throw off my National Forest Pest Strategy hat and talk to you as a forest health biologist who's been in the industry for over 30 years and has been conducting aerial surveys for that entire time frame, believe it or not. So what I'm going to say here are my views, not necessarily the Forest Pest Working Group's. So I want to provide you with a few reasons why I sort of have drank the Kool-Aid on remote sensing, and I suspect that I will probably have drunk the whole junk by the end of the seminar series. I recently had an opportunity to work with some imagery for one of my clients in Victoria, the Capital Regional District watershed, and where I do helicopter surveys every year to map disturbances. But every other year, this is supplemented with an ortho interpretation exercise of the disturbances as well. And what I found was that the ortho photos were amazing, and I was able to capture disturbances that I wasn't able to see from the air. And which was quite disconcerting, but what you see in the upper right-hand side are a bunch of dead lodgepole pine. This is quite extensive in this ecosystem in southern Vancouver Island. The lodgepole pine occupy the very driest of sites, so they get drought stressed and die very quickly. But gray trees are not that easy to pick up during aerial surveys. Red trees and yellow trees and brown foliage are way easier to pick up when you're doing aerial surveys. So, when I flew over these the year after, they're still really not that visible unless we get right over them. Similarly, with the over on the left, we've got some top dieback in an old growth cedar hemlock stand, really not that visible during aerial surveys. And in the middle, we've got root disease in a young Douglas fir plantation. So I found that I was able to see them a lot better because, of course, I can zoom into 1:2000 scale because I'm using GIS tools to do it. And I was also able to delineate them more accurately than I could in a helicopter. And one of the other things is I've observed, and I continue to observe, significant changes across the landscape. Speaking from aerial surveys conducted in southern British Columbia as well as in the Yukon, so that's sort of where my experience is from. We are seeing some significant changes, and I'm seeing some changes on the ground. I walk through these stands, I mountain bike through these stands, and I see drought stress. The trees look like shite. I get up in the air in a fixed-wing aircraft, and I'm flying over these areas, and I cannot see it. And I can't see it because the drought stress that we're seeing here on conifers is, reduced growth and foliage loss, and the needles aren't turning brown; they're just falling off. So from the air, that's very difficult to detect. And the other thing that in some ecosystems, I think we're starting to, the norm is an unhealthy forest. sort of like in these lower elevation stands here in the Okanagan, where like a lot of the trees don't look very, very good. When I do my aerial surveys with Rob Laguerre in Yukon every year, we're like, does that have serpentine leaf miner? Because it's becoming the norm. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Every year after year, and every now and then we'll see this stand of bright green aspen and go, oh yeah, wow, look, there's a healthy stand. So my concern is that we have limited ability to capture all of these things with aerial surveys, and that if this unhealthy landscape is becoming the norm in some ecosystems, and it's, you know, I don't know how widespread it is, I'm speaking from my experience here, how do we calibrate our eye to what a real unhealthy forest looks like when it's become the new norm? And leading into the next part of what I want to say is that, you know, if we actually have shortages in aerial survey capacity and we need to train aerial surveyors, how do we calibrate their eyes when the new norm are these unhealthy forests? So I think that the key to undertaking any monitoring exercise is identifying your objectives beforehand. I think when, you know, Ron Hall, our next speaker, asked me numerous times, what are our objectives? What are your objectives? And trying to drive that message home. And I think that like, the objective really varies by jurisdiction, and it perhaps even varies by pest if you're doing a pest-specific survey. So I think we really need to keep that in mind when we're asking remote sensing specialists what we would like from them. As this helps to identify the resolution required for your expected outcome. Are we happy with knowing it was a defoliator event, or do we want to know that it was eastern spruce flutter? Are we happy with change detection, particularly in the north? Will our expectations vary upon forest management status? You know, do we have a different resolution for managed forests versus unmanaged forests? So in closing, I believe that the forest health community needs to work with remote sensing specialists to help characterize pest signatures. We are the people who know pests. They are the people who know remote sensing. By working together, I think we can start building an enhanced forest health monitoring program capable of both quantifying and qualifying forest health disturbances across the landscape. Thank you.